I want to talk for a few minutes about an encounter that changes everything. In 1840, there was a man born in Manchester, England, called Henry Morehouse. And Henry Morehouse became a gang leader, a very violent man, and suffered with depression. He always carried with him a loaded pistol in his teenage years, not to use on other people, but ready to use on himself in case the depression became overwhelming. In 1861, he was walking past an arena in Manchester, and he heard some noise inside. And he thought there was a fight taking place, so he rushed in, ready to join. But it was actually a gospel meeting, and someone was preaching about the story of the prodigal son. And when Henry Morehouse heard the name Jesus, it was like it pierced his soul. And he became a Christian that night and became a preacher. He ended up preaching to millions of people in the UK and in the United States. But one of the people he had a profound influence on was a man called D.L. Moody, who became the greatest evangelist of the 19th century and who had a phenomenal impact around the world. And so Henry Morehouse became known as the man who moved the world. But it all started with hearing the name of Jesus, and his life was turned around. When we encounter Jesus, it transforms our lives. It redirects us. Paul was someone who had a sense of purpose for his life. He was highly motivated. He was ambitious. He was well connected. He was well trained. And he knew what he wanted to do. And it was to protect his nation, protect his institutions, protect his people. And he knew how to go about it. But then Jesus met with him and changed everything in his life. He redirected him. He said to him, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" Now, in other words, he's saying, what are you doing? You're doing the wrong things. Why are you doing this? And Saul would have thought, oh no, I didn't realize I was doing that. I wasn't deliberately trying to persecute you. I was just trying to do what I thought was the best. But our whole lives, whether we realize it or not, are about our relationship with Jesus. Either we are running towards Jesus or we are running away from him. Either we are attacking him or we are embracing him. Either we are refusing his love or we are letting him love us. Either we are persecuting him or we are proclaiming him. Our life is about Jesus. And so Jesus, I believe, is asking the same question to each of us today. To each of us, why are you holding back? Why are you running away from me? Why are you trying to do my work and not trust in me? Why are you trying to keep me in a box instead of letting me have an influence over all your life? Why are you doing this? Because Jesus wants to redirect us, to put us on new paths. Jesus says to Paul, "Go into the city, and you will be told what you must do." In other words, at the moment you don't know what to do, but I need to tell you. Your instincts are all wrong, but I'm going to show you what to do with your life. And often this means actually taking just one step. Go into the city, that's the first step, and then you'll be told what you have to do after that. This verse actually was very helpful for Tara and me when we were considering coming and planning to come to Brazil. We had this sense that God was calling us to Brazil and to Rio and to this church in particular. But people would ask us, oh, what are you going to do? And we said, oh, we're going to try and move to Brazil. Oh, no, but once you get there, what are you going to do? No, I mean, seriously, we're just going to try and move to Brazil. We've got 4 children. It feels like a huge achievement just to get all 6 of us across an ocean to another city. But this verse kept on coming back to our minds. Go into the city and you will be told what to do. Make the first step and then the rest will become clear. So what's the next step for you that Jesus is asking you to do? What is the next step? Is it to go to a particular place? Is it to start doing something else? What is the first step? Because then other things become clear after that. And there is this sense of, I find so interesting, that when Jesus speaks to Ananias, he says to Ananias, go to Saul, and tell him, go to him, because this man is my chosen instrument to the Gentiles, and I will show him how much he must suffer for my name. So you can imagine Ananias thinking, okay, I'll go to Paul, and I'll tell him about, he's sort of on the edge of becoming a Christian. I'll tell him about, forgiveness for everything, the peace and joy of the Christian life, the removal of shame, eternal life. And Jesus says to him, no, talk to him about how much he must suffer. And you think, Ananias thinking, oh no, that's never going to work. This is really important what I've got to do. This could be the turning point of Christianity. This person who's persecuting us could now be on our side. And you want me to go and tell him about how much he must suffer? But the extraordinary thing is, when Paul is presented with this option of either sticking with everything that he knows, which is being respected, being powerful, being influential, or becoming a Christian and suffering, he chooses to become a Christian. Why? Because he's met Jesus, the one who makes everything worthwhile. We find out from another account that it was noon when the sun shone. And noon, that doesn't mean anything. From England, the noonday sun doesn't really mean anything. It's still quite cold. But in Israel or in Brazil, the noonday sun, is very bright and very strong. But a light far more powerful than the noonday sun has shone upon him. And he's heard a voice more powerful than the voices within or the voices around. He's seen someone who he knows was dead, and now he's convinced that he is alive again. And Paul, was there when Stephen, one of the first Christians, was stoned to death. And he saw that his face shone like an angel as he was being attacked and as he was being killed. And so Paul was beginning to realize here was someone that was worth giving everything to. This was worth everything. And so his life begins to be redirected. But he's not just redirected. He's also recreated. Jesus calls to Saul. He says, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? He calls him by name, which is how God calls people. So in the Old Testament, it's Abraham, Abraham, Jacob, Jacob, Moses, Moses, Samuel, Samuel. Jesus, too, calls Mary, Mary. He confronts Peter, Peter. And so he calls people by name. And it's a way of saying, I know you. I know you better than you know yourself. I know you completely. Again, we find out elsewhere that Jesus spoke to him in Aramaic, the language of Paul's heart. He's saying, I know you completely. I know you completely and utterly, and I love you. He calls him by name. Dale Carnegie, the great motivational speaker from the 20th century, said that a person's name is to that person the sweetest sound in any language. Actually, I knew this once. I was leading a small group, a Christian small group, and there was this woman in the group who was going through a really tough time. And I knew I just needed to reassure her as she spoke. And so as she spoke, she was saying things. I just said, thank you, Claire. Thank you, Claire. Thank you for sharing, Claire. That's really brave, Claire. And eventually she stopped and just turned to me and said, please stop calling me Claire. My name is Jane. And I realized I had seriously messed up that whole situation and done the opposite of what I had intended. But a person's name is very valuable. It shows that you are known. And so Jesus is saying, I know you, Paul. But more than that, Jesus is going to recreate Paul. And so at the beginning of the creation of the world, the first thing that happens is God says, let there be light. And there is this light here. God creates through his voice. And here Paul hears this voice from heaven. Paul is thrown to the ground. And Adam, the first human, was created from the dust of the ground. And so what is happening here is Paul is going back to the beginning. He's being recreated. And Jesus is removing all his pride. Because Paul was incredibly impressive, like all of you. He was very impressive. He was incredibly well educated by the best rabbis of the time. He was a rising star, young, influential. People would lay their clothes at his feet. He could get the high priest to do whatever he wanted. There would be people who would follow him and do whatever he said. He was incredibly at home and successful and important in the Jewish world. But he was also from Tarsus, which was this center of Greek culture and learning. So he was also very good at Greek, familiar with Greek philosophy, and very at home in the Greek philosophical world. And so culturally, he was very impressive too. And then on top of that, unusually for a Jew, he was a Roman citizen. And so of the three overlapping worlds, the Jewish world, the Greek cultural world, and the Roman political world, he was at the top of all of these. And he was wealthy. He had everything. And so Jesus is saying, I'm calling you, and so we need to take away all these things. And so he falls to the ground and needs to start again. The person who was so well educated and can see everything suddenly was blind. The person who would direct other people and lead other people is suddenly being led by the hand as if he were a child. And then who comes to see him? Not Peter, the chief of the apostles. It's Ananias, just a normal Christian who doesn't get another mention in the whole of the Bible. Because Paul needs to realize that all the things that he thought were important, his education, his credentials, his successes, his nationality, none of those were important anymore. And they needed to be stripped away. When Tara and I started dating, my main strategy was to try and impress her. So I came up, the problem was there weren't many things that I could come up with that might impress her. But I thought, I'll invite her. We'd started a new service in the church where I was training. And there were only about 12 people who went to this church. But I thought, come to this church, this service I'm responsible for, and I'll preach and I'll try and impress you. And we'd been dating for a few months, and she said, no, I have my own church. So, okay, that's fine. So she wouldn't come to the church that I was involved with. So then I thought, come and watch me play rugby. And I used to play rugby on Saturday afternoons. And she came to watch me play rugby. And that day, when she came to watch me, I played unbelievably well. I can still remember almost the whole match in my mind, 15 years later. And I just scored try after try after try. And it was right, the try line was just in front of where Tara was sitting. And I just scored all these tries, and I was just playing brilliantly. And then after the game, I said to Tara, what did you think of the game? And she said, I'm sorry, I didn't watch it. I was talking to the person next to me. Now, the thing was, what I was discovering was that Tara actually, not quite then, but eventually, was coming to love me. But not for any of the things that I thought might impress her. She was just loving me. And so for Paul, God needed to remove all the things that he thought were impressive about himself. His nationality, his education, his successes, his power, his influence. And instead, he just needed to learn that he was someone who was just loved by God for who he was. And so Paul later in his writings, even though he's a Roman citizen, which was to be a citizen of the most important, powerful nation, empire of the time, like being Brazilian. And yet, he would start talking about just being a citizen of heaven. He would talk about all his Jewish credentials and achievements, and he said, I consider them to be rubbish. When he talked about the cultural learning and rhetoric and speech and philosophy, he says, I know nothing. I have no wise or persuasive words. But he knew that he was loved by God, and that was all that mattered. And so he is redirected, he is recreated, and then thirdly, he is reconnected. Because Paul has been doing the wrong things for the wrong reasons and with the wrong people. He's got his authority from the wrong person, he's alongside the wrong people, and he's trying to have an impact on the wrong people. And so Jesus comes along and he reconnects him to other people. So Ananias, Barnabas will start coming into his life. Ananias, who knew this person had been responsible for the death of other Christians, comes and lays his hand on him and says, Brother Saul, and shows him that he is loved. Saul will soon discover that the people he thought were his friends were actually his enemies. And the people he thought were his enemies were actually his friends. There would be a complete turnaround. And when this story is told, they often talk about the traveling companions of Paul. Here they talk about how, when they talk about the traveling companions, either they can see the light but can't hear the voice, or they see the light but can't recognize Jesus, or they hear a sound but don't understand what the sound is saying. And what it points to the fact is the people going through life with Paul cannot see Jesus and cannot hear his voice. And this is not a mistake that Paul will make ever again. Because from this moment he will travel all around the Roman world, but he'll always have traveling companions with him. But they are people who know Jesus, who can hear his voice, recognize his voice. Up to this moment, Saul has got his authority from the high priest, but now he's getting his authority from somewhere else. He says to Jesus, Lord. He's saying, you are going to be my Lord. You are going to be the person who directs my life. And instead of trying to have an influence in the Jewish world, which was the only world that Paul was really interested in, he would understand that he was being called to the Gentiles, the non-Jews. And this, for Paul, he was the most Jewish of Jews, and yet called to the Gentiles. But God is always calling us to people who are not like us, and in unexpected ways. When Tara and I first started talking about coming to Brazil, actually it was in those days when we were just dating and trying to work out whether God was calling us to get married. And she said, well, how do you feel about Brazil? And I said, definitely not. Because I love England. I love cricket and stony beaches and cold weather, and where you you wrap up warm and light a fire in the winter and the summer. And I love Radio 4, and I love the English language and English newspapers, and I couldn't really imagine life outside. And yet, God called us to do something very different. And God is always calling us beyond what is comfortable, beyond what is known, into new places, towards new people. And so God reconnects us in whole new ways. When Jesus calls to Paul asks this question, "Who are you, Lord?" This is the crucial question. So often we feel like the crucial question is, who am I? When you're trying to work out the purpose of your life, it's, who am I? What are my gifts? What are my passions? What are my abilities? What could I do? Who am I? And then you work out your purpose. But Paul asks the much more important question of, who are you, Lord? And in discovering who Jesus was, the purpose for Paul's life would become clear. And the purpose of Paul's life would become based not on himself, but on Jesus Christ. And it's the same for each one of us. I mean, for myself, I could say, okay, who am I? And let's work out my purpose from who I am. So I'm Jonny. I'm quite sensitive. I cry in a lot of films and TV and some adverts. And sometimes when people are just talking, I don't have much energy quite a lot of the time. I have quite a good memory for things that don't matter, like 19th century British political history and English cricket games from the 1990s, but not for important things like where I put my keys or what people's names are. And so I could then, okay, well, this is who I am. What could my purpose be based on that? And you think it's probably going to be quite small. Or I could say, Jesus Christ has called me. And he is the beginning and the end. He is the Alpha and the Omega. He is the resurrection and the life. He is the way, the truth, and the life. He is the bread of life. He is the light of the world. And if my purpose is based on him, then nothing is impossible. And so that is the crucial question for each of us. Who are you, Lord? And when we discover who Jesus is, everything else becomes clear. Amen?